we have a series that we do on Motzei Shabbat usually about the halachot of the Beit HaBechira. We're doing that in order the Rambam has it, and I think that's very constructive. We're about to approach an issue, God willing, this week, which is subject to a great controversy between the Rishonim, specifically the eternal sanctity of the place of the temple. And we're going to see the machloket there between the Ravad and the Rambam, Maimonides. And we're going to see a basic answer that many of the commentators give to explain why the halacha follows that opinion of Maimonides and not the Ravad. And that brings up a much bigger discussion. And we're going to discuss that in its place, of course. But a lot of the times I've been making reference to this quite long article I put out just a few weeks ago, and was the basis for a series of shiurim that we had also a few months ago, but in Hebrew. And I think because of the language constraints, it wasn't, I guess, not as many people who are following the series of shiurim on the Rambam in the Hilchot Beit HaBechira are familiar with it, because we're doing these halachot in English. And I think, Baruch Hashem, there's quite a few hundred people who are following it. But the Hebrew shiurim that were basically the background for it were not followed. The other is a hashkafic reason. The other reason for dealing with this now is a hashkafic reason. That is, many of us heard what the Rav had to say when he spoke in Efrat. I think it was last week. He was talking about understanding the historical context and significance of the paramiracle situation, wherein we don't see any great wonders and signs, miracles on the, I wouldn't say order of magnitude, but of the flavor of the type, let's say, described with the Exodus, supernatural almost. And even then, we've also been hearing Dr. England, perhaps it's not supernatural, there's always a natural explanation, but the sea splitting when the Israelites needed it, and the rest of the plagues happening just at the right time, even though, yes, you could come up with a naturalistic explanation, of course, we still consider that historically miraculous. But those are amazing things. The paramiracle is nothing like that. Yet, we do see that that is a miracle, and a person has the right conceptions and the right perception of how God works in this world will understand that that's a miracle. And the problem is that sometimes people lose that, or they never develop that proper perception. And then they think that for something to be a godly miracle, or a miracle worth celebrating, let's say establishing a day eternally every year thereof on that date to thank God and to acknowledge the miracles they had for us, so that prevents them from doing such a thing. I would think that properly understanding Purim, for example, and Hanukkah gives a person the proper mindset for understanding why it is, for example, we should celebrate Israeli Independence Day, which the Rav calls Yom Tikumat Yisrael, not Yom Ha'atzmaut, and Yom Yerushalayim, because those are very similar. Almost a kal v'chomer. If you celebrate Hanukkah, which already was thousands of years ago, and most of the achievements of Hanukkah have been undone, kal v'chomer, you should be celebrating Yom Yerushalayim, which is similar, or like I said, the founding of the state of Israel. So we have to have these proper perceptions, and we don't have these perceptions, we could be misled, and perhaps we don't even appreciate these things. Specifically, the Six-Day War is something that's very close to my heart. I was born in 1982. That was 15 years almost. It was February, so it was almost 15 years after the events of the Six-Day War. But I found in yeshiva as a young man, when I was about 21 years old, my fellow yeshiva students, I wouldn't say colleagues because we're just a bunch of kids, even those 4 years older than me, within 4 years younger than me, that's what basically we had in yeshiva. Everybody from the age of like 25 to 17 was there. They were not really aware of what the Six-Day War was about even. Some, yeah, they went to the right yeshiva where they celebrated such a thing, but they were missing a lot of context, and they did not understand it. They didn't understand what was worth celebrating. So that was a problem, and we tried to correct these problems. I saw, with regards to temple-related issues, sometimes we develop this perception. We think that things should be the way that we want them to be. Why is it that some people don't view, for example, the founding of the State of Israel as part of as a stepping stone or toward the ultimate redemption? It's because it didn't work out the way they told it was going to work out. It's not the way they conceived the way it was going to be. Even though we saw earlier that the Rambam already said, well, no one knows how it's going to work out in the end, how the redemption works, but here's a list of things that have to happen. Even the idea that the Messiah has to come first before, for example, the ingathering of the exiles and the rebuilding of the temple, that's not necessarily the way it's going to work out. And we've actually seen this now, that the ingathering of the exiles and the founding of the Third Commonwealth have both preceded the arrival of any promised Messiah. That doesn't mean he's not coming. That just means that those who were thinking or who were demanding or who felt set in this belief that the Messiah has to come first and everything else follows are now stuck. And that preconceived notion, that limiting belief, holds them back from being able to properly acknowledge God's hand in history. So too with temple-related issues. Sometimes we have preconceived notions, or we just have these ideas that we're too stuck on, and we perceive as a future temple as having to fit a certain mold or having to be a certain way, but it's not that way. And perhaps that's also the way Rambam and Rashi and other Rishonim didn't understand it. It doesn't have to work out the way we wanted it to work out. And even worse, sometimes we have these irrational beliefs. The Rav likes to talk about the belief that some have that the temple will eventually just be made by heaven. It'll fall from heaven literally. I don't know at what speed it will fall, because a fall from that height could possibly destroy it in the process. But understand, this leads to a lot of difficult problems. Some people can't conceive of eventually us building a temple. He calls that a pernicious belief. And sometimes these other irrational beliefs hold us back from eventually being able to do this. What does it lead to? For example, this idea that the temple has to come down from heaven. It'll lead to people sitting back and thinking there is nothing we should do and there's nothing we can do to build the temple. For example, that was a big dispute between Rabbi Ariel, and I think it was Rabbi Ariel or Rav Lior. Now I'm confused. I think it was Rav Ariel or Lior. I haven't seen it, but the response of the current chief rabbi, who's a scholar in his own right, he basically took the position of that he doesn't want to hear any more discussion about potentially building the temple and ascending the Temple Mount, all the things that perhaps we've been advocating for, because he wants no discussion of it. He holds la halacha that nothing should be done. We're just supposed to sit back and wait. It's all in God's hands. So that holds him back. And I'm sure that that's why you have men like Rav Lior and Rav Ariel and others who are trying their best to persuade him and the masses, and at least those Jews who don't want to be considered just part of the blind masses, the sheep, those who want to know more and learn about these halachot and actually try to take an active part in making these nevuot come true. So that's not good enough for them. They want actually to be able to do it. So I saw that with regards to another temple-related issue, this idea about how the temple's sanctity has a certain eternity, at least in the way Rambam understands it, and they attributed that to, I think, supernatural means. Specifically, they attribute it to the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was something that was quite special. I don't know how holy it was. We talk about levels of holiness, and there's parts of the Gemara about this, and there's halachot. They're actually halachot pisukot, or as we say in Yiddish, paskind. These are well-grounded and encoded halachot. By encoded, I mean they're in the codes. That, for example, Torah scroll is of the highest sanctity, and synagogues are also of a certain sanctity because they house the Torah scroll. And there were quite a few contemporary scholars who were of the belief, because they actually saw this in the writings of the Achronim, and first in the Meiri of all places, that the sanctity of the temple is due to the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. And I was trying to show them that Maimonides certainly doesn't hold of such an idea. And holding that the Ark of the Covenant does have a certain specialness that the sages didn't explicitly attribute to it, leads people to have the belief that the Ark of the Covenant is some sort of talisman, some sort of magical device that holds godly powers. Think Indiana Jones in the Last Crusade. That's how people perceive of the Ark of the Covenant. That's how good from Jews perceive of such a thing. And that's, at least I think, from a rational perspective, certainly from a Maimonidean perspective, that is incorrect. And I want to even show them that uh, just like in the times of the prophet Samuel, when he was just assuming the leadership of the Jewish people, and later in the times before the destruction of the first temple, the Jews relied on this too much. They thought that the sanctuary, whether it was at Shiloh or in Jerusalem, which housed the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant itself, had God's presence literally there. So literal, in fact, that no harm could come to those items or places. And that was a slightly idolatrous belief, and that had to be removed from the people. And that's why the Ark of the Covenant was ultimately removed and hidden, because the people had this perception that nothing bad could harm to, no harm could come to it, and no harm could come to them because they possessed these things, the temple and the Ark, and that was holding them back from true repentance. And the truth is that God gives his protection to those who keep his will, keep the Torah and mitzvot, and it has nothing to do with whether or not they have a temple. Similarly, we have a theme in this week's parasha, at least in the commentaries, about what is the meaning of sacrifice itself. There were people who had this perception that they could atone for their mistakes, they can make up for anything, they can compensate for their sins or for their failures by sacrifice. You give a fat bull, that will make up for it. And that's also an idea that had to be removed from the Jewish psyche. That's a big problem. The prophets spoke out against this many different times. So people had this idea, just give it to God. And even nowadays, people sometimes they have guilty consciences. They have ill-gotten gains. So what do? They make large donations to the yeshiva or to the synagogue in the hope that that will somehow make up for what they have done wrong. And the sages describe this as the motivation, for example, for the rejection, the Torah's rejection of sacrifice or given from funds raised by, quote, selling a dog or the hire of a harlot, because those types of people maybe feel guilty about what they did to earn that money, so they tried to do something to make up for it. The Torah doesn't want such a thing. So let's get into this right now. I'm going to share the screen. We're going to see these notes over here. If you were originally heard the shiurim in Hebrew, they were in more detail. This is just the English summation, even though it's quite long. And I also made it available online to the general public. So if it sounds familiar, it's because it already was written mostly. But this idea why I wrote it is new. It's just for now. And also we're going to discuss, God willing, Motzei Shabbat, some nitty-gritty halachot about this one. I'll just give a little bit of a trailer. A good question was asked. How is it that we can offer sacrifice when we don't have public funds? Sacrifice is supposed to come from the machatzita shekel. Ideally, around now, people are supposed to be getting their act together and donating a certain amount of silver toward the temple, and that pays for the public sacrifices. Yet we have no commandment today to do such a thing because the temple's not standing. The temple was not standing before it was built, obviously, but the first stage in building the second temple was rebuilding the altar and then offering the sacrifice. So they had sacrifices going on a daily basis in the second temple's courtyard, even before the second temple was built, and they started collecting the machatzita shekel, the half shekels. So where did they get the funds for that sacrifice? And how could, even if they got the funds, how could they offer sacrifice from those funds if those were not machatzita shekel? The public sacrifices are supposed to come from the funds collected from all the Jewish people, or at least those Jewish people who volunteer to give the half shekel. And we will deal with that question and show that based on the Magen Avraham and others, there is, within the writings of the Rambam, we find very clear answers to those questions. So we have here the basic questions that we start with regarding the difference between the first temple and the Mishkan at Shilo. What was the Mishkan at Shilo? The sages describe it based on traditions and verses in the Torah, in the Nevi'im, about how it wasn't the same Mishkan that was used in the wilderness, the 40 years of traveling, and then the 14 years it stood in Gilgal when they first entered the land of Israel. That Mishkan was basically entirely prefabricated and deconstructible and reconstructible. The walls of the main room that was the Mishkan, remember, it was just one large room divided by a curtain not necessarily down the middle, but the west side of the building was cut off from the rest of it by the parochet, the curtain. That building was basically made of boards, boards made out of wood, overlaid with gold, and then bound together and covered with a triple layer covering, which is called the Mishkan, the Ohel, and the Mechseh. And the sages say that this tabernacle at Shiloh was basically that same covering, but on a permanent stone structure. And Maimonides says clearly, explicitly, that this Mishkan was then put back into use in Nov and Givon. Nov and Givon were the places where the sacrifice was all offered after Shiloh was destroyed. The sages say the tabernacle stood for 369 years in Shiloh, and then another 54 years between Nov and Givon. And in Nov and Givon, that was the tabernacle as it existed in the wilderness. So those boards were still used, those gold-covered boards. And those are the ones that are described that when Solomon dedicated the temple, he brought the old Mishkan and its components up to the temple and put them into Gnizah, which is basically safekeeping. They're hidden from view and they shouldn't be used again. So what happened to those golden boards, all those 369 years that the temple, sort of lack of a better word, the tabernacle, tabernacle is what we call a mishkan over here, by the way. That refers to the thing that could be taken apart and put back together on a per need basis. And sanctuary is the general term that we use for both a tabernacle and a temple. And that's the more halachically precise term. And that's apparently the translation of mikdash, which the Rambam uses as a coverall, as the umbrella term for all these things. And that was basically also standing at Shiloh. That was the insides. They made a permanent stone structure to house the sanctuary. So what does that mean? I understood it that because we see that there's a commandment to make the temple as much as possible covered in gold, at least on the outside, and then on and the inside, and then the outside. That's how it existed in the desert, and that's how Solomon built the first temple. The inside was entirely covered in gold, and there was a fund in the second temple times also to cover the entire Holy of Holies with gold. It's called the Zahav Lakaporet. That's explicit in the Tosefta Tishkalim, that they used to collect extra gold just to overlay eventually the entire inside of the Kodesh Kodeshim, which is quite a large room. So if they made this tabernacle at Shiloh of stone, yet they kept the old boards that were covered in gold just in safekeeping, I don't think that was the case. I think that they erected the tabernacle's boards as it always was, and then built an outside frame of stone, such that someone from the outside saw stone, but on the inside, he saw the original gold coverings, the golden walls, basically, of the tabernacle with which Moses and Aaron themselves were familiar. And that's why they didn't have to be put into storage, and that's why it doesn't mention anything about them missing. It was just a permanent structure that held on to it. And that was eventually destroyed by the Philistines. So the question is, we see there's so much detail describing the first temple's destruction, and also a lot of details describing the construction of the tabernacle. Remember, we've had now, for those of us in the 1 year cycle, not the 3 year cycle, but even the 1 year cycle people, they've been reading over the past 5 weeks about the construction of the tabernacle, and there's so much detail there. And also the first temple, quite a lot of detail, and also details about its destruction. Yet the construction of the tabernacle at Shiloh has no such detail, and also its destruction, if it was destroyed, isn't even mentioned explicitly in the book of Samuel. If you study the book of Samuel, you see that the Ark of the Covenant was captured in war after they removed it from Shiloh, and you see that Eli the high priest died of grief. He fell off his own chair and broke his neck, and his sons were killed in battle. And next thing we know, the Ark of the Covenant is, thank God, returned by the Philistines, but we basically read between the lines that their sacrifice is now being offered in Nov. And we're going to get to where did Nov come from. That itself is a big chidush. And eventually, we see that the tabernacle is moved to Givon. What happened to the tabernacle at Shiloh? And the sages say, yes, it was destroyed. That's an explicit verse. Or explicit verses in the Psalms and in the book of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. They say it quite clearly. Yeah, the tabernacle was destroyed. It was just a terrible thing. I want to bring the sources here, God willing, just to compile this. A lot of Jews went into exile also, by the way, with the destruction of the tabernacle at Shiloh. Not that the conquerors, let's say the Babylonian conquerors, the Roman conquerors, forcibly took many exiles into their foreign countries, but that the Philistines, over the course of the next few years, caused many Jews to become refugees and leave their country and had to find a place to live elsewhere. That is almost explicit in quite a few verses, and it's hinted at many times from contemporary writings that we have. That is, even though, yes, let's say the tribe of Yehuda got to stay on its land, and the tribe of Asher was also not exiled, many Jews in the Galil and along the coast and in what we now call the Shomron did have to leave their ancestral lands, and that was a sore point, and that's what David HaMelech, King David, put right, that he was the first one to do an ingathering of the exile, so to speak. So just like there was only a destruction of the tabernacle, of the sanctuary, was only alluded to and is not so explicit, so too the Jews going into the diaspora, into the exile at the time, is also not so explicit and shared in detail. But if you look at it and you look for it, you'll see that it's there, and they're praying for a reinstatement. That is, the Jewish people, the Israelites at the time, also be brought back to their lands. And eventually that's why, by the way, King David is a template for the Messiah. He brought about all these things in his day, and the Messiah is supposed to do that for us also. So we see that we see these questions over here. So much detail devoted, yet we don't see that with regards to the Tabernacle at Shiloh. Also, we have here the thing from the Bar-Hayim that he said that had the temple been built by Moses, it would never have been destroyed. Many people think that that's a Ma'amar Chazal, that Chazal said such a thing, but Chazal never said such a thing. The Bar-Hayim said that. That doesn't mean it's not worth learning about, because perhaps he has quite a lot of sources. I just saw recently that the Malbim says, someone online wrote up the Malbim who says that just like you could study sacrifice, you study the halachot of an individual sacrifice, and God counts it as though you had offered that sacrifice. And that works both for individuals, neshama farim sifatenu, and also for the community. That's what Abraham was told at the Brith ben Abitharim, according to one Midrashic account. And so he says, so too, you study the laws of the temple and its construction. It's as though you took part in the construction of the temple. And for us, that's very comforting. That's why we study these things. I hope that's true. The problem is that we don't have a source for that claim of the Malbim. I think that, unfortunately, maybe that's perhaps questionable. And I think Adarabba, I can understand why an individual or even a community at one point or another cannot offer sacrifice. But there cannot be a replacement for trying to take a part in the physical construction of the temple. That's what the lesson is. There are some things, yes, so you learn about it. You study the halachot, and it's as though you achieve that mitzvah. That doesn't work for wearing tefillin. That does not work for the mitzvah to raise children. That does not work for tzitzit. That does not work for quite a few mitzvot. There's some mitzvot where you have to actually try to do it yourself. You have to try to do it. And I think that, like I said, that's an idea that perhaps maybe we could tell people we hope the Malbim's wrong. Just like we tell people, don't rely on the fact that the temple is going to fall from heaven. You want to try taking a part in this. Also, don't rely on the fact that you have somehow discharged your obligation to take a hand, lend a hand in the construction of the temple. No, you can't get you're not exempt. You have to try to do it to the best of your ability. So we had here other ideas. I saw some wonderful scholarship commentaries on books of the Bible here from Rabbanim who were raised at Merkaz Rav, and actually got into arguments with them, first in correspondence and then on the telephone. So this is a very personal thing. And someone said, why is this all about? You use the word I and I a lot. See, there's where I occurs already in these two paragraphs. Twice in this paragraph already. Why is it about it? Because these ideas came, we were able to explicate these ideas because we were involved in discussions. And I was trying to prove my point, and it's good. Mitalmida yoter mikulam, mirabotai, I could also learn a little bit. So we were getting into very not personal arguments, but everybody was very, very much quite vocal about their beliefs in this case. And that's why I have to say because I was arguing this position against the position of those who wrote over here. So it's personal to the extent that these were ideas that I was not necessarily, I don't believe them. I don't have much confidence in these ideas, but I was the one arguing their points. So I attribute them to myself as opposed to those who I was responding to. So we have here this idea that they had said that the destruction of the tabernacle wasn't so remarkable because it wasn't its level of holiness was not like that of Jerusalem, and it had already once the Ark of the Covenant was removed from the Shiloh tabernacle, for example, that basically removed it from the status of being a tabernacle. And I showed that no, I don't think that's the case. I thought it was otherwise. And here, this is Rabbi Shindorfi sent me this Chevel Nachlato. There's a Meshech Chachma, and I think that that wasn't the case. It's that, and let's get back to Or HaChaim. The Or HaChaim, it does have a Ma'amar Chazal which says that the tabernacle never fell into the hands of the heathens and was destroyed, and therefore, and that shows because it was built by Moses. Moses's handiwork was not destroyed. So I wanted to use this as the basis for saying that really, before the Philistines made it to Shiloh in that battle, which is described in I think was the third or fourth chapter of Samuel, before they made it there, they had basically evacuated the entire tabernacle as it was. Everything that Moses actually built was there. And what the Philistines discovered was the stone edifice that was there just to house the tabernacle as like a frame around it, and that they knocked down. And anything of actual value, they were able to evacuate to Nov. And that's what the sages mean, that it wasn't destroyed, because they evacuated it. Basically, everything that Moses had made its way to Nov and could not have been captured by the Philistines. So it wasn't a tragedy that needed to be remarked upon. It was just that now the people realize God does not want the tabernacle at Shiloh anymore. So there are no spoils taken and all those other details. I think that fits it. I think that's a very good explanation. But you can understand why the Or HaChaim would make this conjecture, which is, I think it's based, it's quite as basis that, so if Moses had built the temple, that also wouldn't have fallen into the hands of the heathens, but he did not do so. So we don't really know. And they say something similar about King David, that he was prevented from doing so. Also, that's not explicit in Chazal. That's also not explicit in the verses. Even the idea that King David was not allowed to build the temple, by the way, because he was involved in so much bloodshed, even if for the right purposes, it might not be that was the case. What do I mean? That's a verse in Divrei Yamim. King David tells his son that he wanted to have built the temple, but instead God told him his son will have to do it. You've spilled too much blood. Your hands have spilled too much blood. Now, we don't see that in the message that God gave to David, both in Divrei Yamim and in the book of Shmuel, which is very similar accounts. There's like slight differences, like with anything that occurs in Divrei Yamim. It matches a source in the rest of the Bible, but not exactly. There's a word here too, word you're missing here or there, or a slight difference in the spelling, etc. In the book of Samuel and earlier in Divrei Yamim, King David is told that he cannot build the temple because for whatever reason, it doesn't actually say explicitly, but more that's God's will that David's son do so. It doesn't say because David was shed too much blood. And then when David says that, you can interpret this in one of two ways. You could say that yes, David's just filling in missing details that we don't have earlier in the story, that God told him he couldn't build the temple because he had shed a lot of blood. Or you can interpret it to mean that David was guessing when he says this, and it's recorded in the book of Chronicles, that he told his son Solomon, I can't build a temple because God said I spilled too much blood. Maybe that's his interpretation of why he couldn't. But it's not necessarily the case that is why he couldn't. There's a very fine distinction there. And you could look in the commentators, you see that there is room to say what I'm saying now. I don't think there's one what they say argument that's machria, something that gives us a real proof to either position. I'm just saying it's tenable. So the tabernacle never fell into enemy hands. So I was discussing this idea with the rabbis because we're getting to the halacha here about the Heterba. What is the Heterba? And by the way, please stop me if you have a question. The Heterba is mentioned in the Mishnah in Zvachim as a state that existed at certain points in Jewish history, allowing for sacrifice outside of the central sanctuary. So when was that the case? So the Mishnah describes basically before the tabernacle was built, Jewish people, Israelites, could offer sacrifice to God wherever they wanted. They could build an altar and offer sacrifice. But once they built the Mishkan in the wilderness and it stood as it was, they had to bring sacrifice and sometimes even chulin, non-sacrificial food, to the sanctuary for slaughtering. That's where they had to do it. and that was a state that existed until they crossed the Jordan River. And it says that when they crossed the river and they put the Mishkan, the same exact Mishkan that existed in the wilderness, they brought it to Gilgal. They were allowed to offer sacrifice wherever they wanted to once again. And then when they brought the sanctuary to Shiloh, suddenly the Bamot is, by the way, literally it's a high place, but it's an expression that Chazal use based on its use many times in the Book of Kings for meaning any private altar, not the central altar, or what I call a backyard altar, backyard mizbeach. And those Bamot are suddenly prohibited in the times that Shiloh stood. Once again, that meant that sacrifice could only be offered within the sanctuary at Shiloh. Hold on, gotta get rid of this. And then once again, there was a Heterba similar to the kind that existed in Gilgal when the tabernacle was at Gilgal. The entire time the tabernacle stood in Nov and Givon, and it was only with the inauguration of the temple in Jerusalem that the Bamot were once again prohibited, and this time for good. And they never had a heter after that. So the question here was the reason for such a thing. You read in the Mishnah that just talks about, yes, the Bamot were first permitted and then prohibited, and then permitted and then prohibited, and then permitted and then prohibited. You can see it jumping back and forth. Before Mishkan, they were permitted. When the Mishkan was built in the wilderness, they were prohibited. When the Israelites came into land the first 14 years, they were once again permitted. And then during the Shiloh period, they were prohibited. And between Shiloh and Jerusalem, when the tabernacle stood in Nov and Givon, once again, they were permitted. And once it was built in Jerusalem, the tabernacle, the sanctuary, so it was prohibited once for good. And this actually has something to do with Korban Pesach. We saw sometime earlier. Why is it the Pesach has a specific commandment? All sacrifices have to be offered in the tabernacle, but it says, and even the Korban Pesach, or especially Korban Pesach, has to be offered in the central tabernacle. One of the running themes we had is, why was Korban Pesach specifically introduced with this? Don't offer it on a bama, on your own private altar, even when you have a chance to offer other sacrifice on a private altar. Why was this prohibition, so to speak, doubled? And you can go look about that. We have other videos, I think, or at least some material in the Haggadah Pesach about why that would be the case. And these other Achronim, the Meiri, the Meshech Chachma, the Chevel Nachlato, some of the rabbis at Merkaz, they were saying basically, and this is something that I thought was untenable, but they also have, apparently Rabbi Soloveitchik said this, that the Heter Bamot was strictly something that depended on the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. That is, the Ark of the Covenant was in the tabernacle as it was in the desert, never removed, so that's why you can only offer sacrifice at the tabernacle as it was. But when they were in Gilgal, there was wars going on. There was 14 years of basically conquest of the land and dividing the land. The Ark was always going out to war with them, so that tabernacle did not have that status, and they could offer sacrifice outside the tabernacle. It never left Shiloh, so that was when the Bamot were prohibited. And in the times when the tabernacle stood in Nov and Givon, the Ark of the Covenant was kept in storage, basically. It was kept in the house of various Levites during those periods. And then David brought it up to Jerusalem, but he didn't bring it back to Givon. It was basically waiting for the temple to be built there. And because there was no Ark of the Covenant in Nov and Givon, that's what allowed for sacrifice to be offered elsewhere. Those sanctuaries were almost lacking their sanctity, so to speak, because the Ark of the Covenant was not there. And they even say that there's a proof to this from what Maimonides wrote. And I was trying to argue that if you look in both Talmudim, this argument they gave that the Heter Bamot depends on the presence of the Ark of the Covenant is a Hava Amina in the Gemara, but is rejected. It's rejected in the Yerushalmi where it's first brought up. And then you could see that the conclusion of both Talmudim, and this is what's brought, by the way, in Rambam's Perush HaMishnayot, where he brings us explicitly, he says, the fact that there was a Heter Bamot, people could offer sacrifice outside the main sanctuary wherever they wanted to at certain points in history, was entirely dependent on an oral tradition explaining the source psukim, the source verses. It says regarding sacrifice outside the tabernacle, you have not yet come until this point, El Hamenucha ve'el Nachala, to the resting place, and Menucha is the resting place, and Nachala is God's portion that God will give to you, and that's in the parsha of Re'eh. We read it every year during the summer when people are learning the least, and uh, both Talmudim basically say that the Menucha was a reference to Shiloh, and the Nachala is the temple in Jerusalem. And when they were not in those places, that is, when they did not put the tabernacle in those places, then they would be allowed to offer sacrifice wherever they wanted to. And that's the bottom line. And to go and uh, there's no reason to go look for some other halachic mechanism for allowing for the heter bamot. Now that's an important thing because they're saying no, it has to do with the presence of the Ark of the Covenant, and that brings up a nafkamina. That is, if the Ark of the Covenant was removed from, let's say, the Shiloh sanctuary on a temporary basis, or even from the temple in Jerusalem, that would allow for sacrifice beyond the central sanctuary. And that's a big surprise. And also, that's one of the rhetorical questions that the Rishalmi asks about this Havamina. Are you trying to tell me that there could have been a Heter Bamot even, let's say, during the times of King Chizkiyahu, King Hezekiah, the greatest of the Judean kings, and also the one who was praised by the Navi profusely for being much more righteous than his predecessors and successors, in that he was the one who finally did away with the Bamot. It was a problem that during the times of the kings of Judah, even when the temple was built, they could not handle this prohibition. And there were many places where they were offering sacrifice, not idolatrous sacrifice, but they were doing it within the land of Yehudah itself. They had this form of worship that was strictly prohibited, and the kings could not lay down the law and stop this from happening until Chizkiyahu came about and did it himself. He got rid of the Bamot. So you're trying to tell me that if they had removed the Ark of the Covenant for whatever reason from the temple on a temporary basis, just like they took it out to war many times in history, if they had done such a thing that would have allowed a heter bamot on a temporary basis, it can't be that that was the case. And I was trying to argue with them that instead, no, this is just the pasuk, and that's the way the Rambam holds. And you can't derive anywhere from the Rambam that the sanctity of the temple. By the way, that's what he means. The sanctity of the temple means this is the only place in which you can offer sacrifice, and this is a place which is in which is prohibited to enter under certain circumstances. That is not contingent on the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant isn't some magical device that allows for this. The Ark of the Covenant is just one of many relics kept in the temple. And when the people had a chance or could have been corrupted by such a thing, it was removed from them. And like we saw also with the anointing oil and other things that were hidden because perhaps they would end up falling into the wrong hands and be used for the wrong purpose. So here's where I have the question here. What was the halachic mechanism? And by the way, this idea, I just said I deny it because I think that that's what the Talmud says, and that's what the Rambam says explicitly. The Ark of the Covenant is what allows for either the prohibition or the permission of the bamot, the private altars, is said explicitly by the Meiri over here. He says, see? Because the ark was not there where the altar was, God's central altar, hutra bamot, the high places were therefore permitted. And we see this also in the Meshech Chochmah and some other sources mention it. But here is the Gemara in Zvachim, which is right here. It says it. They say no. It's a drasha that they basically learned. And by the way, it seems that it was Samuel the prophet himself who taught the people this idea that the tabernacle has been destroyed at Shiloh. It's been moved. The central place of worship is now in a place called Nov. It's been moved to there. Now we are in the inter-sanctuarial period, the time between Menucha and Nachala. And only once we get to this Nachala state only once we get to the state will the Bamot become prohibited once again. So that's what we have over here. And there was also an idea here taken from the Chevel Nachalato. You could find this book online now. It's made available entirely, even in wiki text, which is surprising. That shows you its seminal importance of this book, which is only written a few years ago. By a few years, I mean in terms of decades. But when we have a religion that's few thousand years old. A few decades is still quite recent. So he brings this idea over here that the Mizbeach that existed Novin Yvon, look at this, he uses the word Yerad Madrigato Liot Bama Gedola. It was only what he calls a Bama Gedola. It went down a notch, so to speak. That's what he uses over here. Yerad Madrigato. It went down from its level. And I also said that this idea, I don't see that in the Gemara. It doesn't say such a thing. Adarabba, it was just as holy. The Mizbeach, what was done on the altars in Nog and Givon was identical to that which they did in the altars the entire time they stood in Shilo and in Yerushalayim. It's just that also a person could offer certain sacrifices on the Bama, but it doesn't mean that that which was done at the central sanctuary and on the central Mizbeach was any different. And this is something we saw recently over here, that the diuk of that they say in the name of Rabbi Soloveitchik. This is brought by Rav Eli Tzur, had put this out, Professor Eli Tzur, with whom, by the way, Rabbi Huda Eli Tzur was also a phenomenal scholar. He wrote a few of the Perushim that Dot Mikra, as I'm pointing it to over there. He wrote, I think, the Perush on Shoftim, if not Shmuel. I have to check the exact ones. And his son is a very nice fellow. He has guided me to see quite a few things, and he'll come up again later at the end of this, why it is that what we have to say about Nov. But he says that when he wrote this article, and it appears in English, he says he wasn't giving his own opinion, he was just giving what he had from the Meshech Chochmah and his father, which is, why does Maimonides mention that the Ark of the Covenant was hidden within the Temple Mount, hidden under the temple, so to speak? We'll close with this. And they basically say it's because the temple, for its sanctity to continue even until today, Rambam says that also. We're going to see this, God willing, Motzei Shabbos. He says the temple is still the temple today, and you can still offer sacrifice in the temple, even when the temple is in a state of destruction. They wanted to make a diuk, like they say in Yiddish. They wanted to infer from Maimonides' writing over here that the ark needed to stay in the temple. Why was this important? Well, we know that it's a historical dispute. You read the Gemara, and the sages don't have a consensus what happens to the Ark of the Covenant. It seems to have disappeared from history. There are those who claim it was even taken away into Babylon, or Babylonia. Yet Rambam seems to be ruling, or poskening, as they say, on this historical matter and saying no, the Ark was kept in the area of the temple. According to the Mishnah, was this opinion at least, it was kept under the Dir HaEtzim, in the in the northeast corner of the women's courtyard, which is actually quite far from the Holy of Holies. But the ark had to stay within the temple in order for the temple's sanctuary to sanctity to persist even until today. So I showed that doesn't seem to fit what the Talmud is saying. The sanctity of the temple seems to be an eternal thing because God said so, and because there are psukim that say this. And what the Rambam's talking about over here, that the Ark of the Covenant was hidden, is because he's mentioning the place where the Ark of the Covenant at the stand. And the Maimonides' main point is that the Holy of Holies is still the Holy of Holies, even when the Ark is removed. What's the nafkamina? What's the practical application of that halacha? That the high priest is the only one who's allowed in there under certain circumstances, and when the workers want to go in there, they have to go also under certain means. They can't walk in through the main entrance. They have to go through the elevator, and they can't look at anything they're not supposed to look at. That's what he's trying to say. But the fact that the Ark of the Covenant was hidden is not because the temple needs the Ark of the Covenant, so to speak, in order to enjoy this state of eternal sanctity. And that was a very important point. You could read the details over here. We don't have time because we want to see more of this. And I also recommend people get an uncensored commentary, of course, the Rambam's uncensored commentary, in a good translation, because these things become a lot more clear when they see it actually there. And I was also trying to argue that is what the Maimonidean definition of what a sanctuary is. A sanctuary is a mikdash l'chol davar. That was a phrase I used in conversation, and also the Rav himself used this thing. He basically describing what Rambam says. Rambam defines what a mikdash is, and that mikdash does not need the Ark of the Covenant. And the nafkamina also between us is that, according to Rambam, and he says this quite explicitly in three places, the sanctuaries as it stood in Nov and Givon, the Ark of the Covenant was never even there. Never brought there, never moved there. They never were there. Those were 100% sanctuaries, just like Shiloh and just like the one, God willing, that will stand in Jerusalem, according to Rambam at least. Even if they never had the Ark of the Covenant. Yes, there was a Heterba, and yes, the Ark of the Covenant was somewhere else, but it had nothing to do with it. Those are 100% the sanctuary, Mikdash, as the Rambam calls it, because the Rambam has his own definition of Mikdash, and it doesn't rely on, let's say, the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. That's why also, by the way, they didn't make a new one, and why he doesn't list it as one of the things that defines a Mikdash. We've seen these all in the Shirim. So we're going to cut it for tonight, but that basically is the thesis we have going. That according to the Rambam, just like we saw, he calls the entire Temple Mount, by the way, the entire Temple Mount is Mikdash according to the Rambam. According to the Rambam, Mikdash does not require an Ark of the Covenant, and any inference against that is refuted, like the Rav said also. He was talking about getting drunk on Purim. Says you could read Rambam in one halacha in Hilchot Purim, and basically it says, okay, I should be getting drunk on Purim. But then you read what he says elsewhere, and you realize he doesn't mean that. He means, drink a little bit more than you're used to, so that you change your state of mind, and then take a nap. But it doesn't mean get drunk. So too, even if you can infer once that the Ark of the Covenant is a necessary piece of the sanctuary, and actually what grants it its eternal sanctity, so that you could offer sacrifice therein, and so that sacrifice cannot be offered somewhere beyond the temple, and that there's limited access to certain areas on the temple. All those do not fit with what Rambam writes explicitly in his Perush HaMishnayot and his understanding of the Talmudic sources. And by the way, like I said, you read the Talmudic sources, you see that that's certainly not the case. And what Rambam wrote in the Perush HaMishnayot seems to be a very good summation of both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. So unless there's questions there, any questions in the chat? I don't see it. Hold on. No. Okay. So we'll call that a night, and God willing, we'll continue this later. I bless us once again that soon, thank you. Soon we should all live happy and healthy lives and take an active role in the rebuilding of the temple and the reinitiation of the temple service, just as we've been praying for. We should have neshama farim sifatenu, but not only that, our lips should be one with our heart. When we pray, we have to make sure that which we're saying is what we really mean. And we've been praying for the reinstitution of all of these things, and we should really mean it, and we should really see it. So have a good night.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.